Hi, everybody. Welcome to our video on plant nutrition. This may seem like a harsh transition from endocrine system in the study of hormones and how they regulate our body systems. But in my classes, I took the time to direct everybody down to the very last page in our plant nutrition uh, notes where it does talk about chemical control in plants, because even like humans, animals, and the like, they use hormones to help regulate their bodies as well. So plant hormones can include a group of compounds that regulate their body systems too. So let's start at the first page, which outlines the difference between autotrophs and heterotrophs. Organisms that are capable of making their own food from inorganic substances include the two categories of photoautotrophs, which use light to do this, and chemoautotrophs that use chemical energy to do this. Now, typically, the chemoautotrophs are bacteria, but it's important to make the connection between our classification unit that we did earlier in the school year, where we talked about how bacteria can be photoautotrophs or chemoautotrophs. Heterotrophs are individuals that obtain energy from the food they eat. Now, humans, animals as a group, all animals are heterotrophs, but there are groups of organisms that are photoheterotrophs, and this is a unique category of organism that requires some light energy to help with their metabolism and processing of materials within their bodies. Plants, however, are unique in that they do photosynthesis using chloroplasts. So this is a process by which energy from light is converted into chemical energy in the form of sugars, usually glucose or fructose, um, and it can be galactose or sucrose as well. This occurs in the chloroplasts, where there are two primary pigments, chlorophyll A and B. These two pigments trap the sun's light energy, and they reflect wavelengths that they are colored. So this is how plants end up with a green color. And if you actually look down a little bit farther, you'll see that chlorophyll B has this more green shade here. And that is the primary reflected color of chlorophyll B. It's going to be green. So plants don't use green colored light to grow. They primarily rely upon red and blue. These are the wavelengths of light that are most effective due to the level of absorption that they endure. We can separate these different pigments using chromatography, which we learned about earlier in the school year. It's a process by which we take a mashed up version of a leaf. You can grind it up and dissolve it in a solvent, and you put a small solvent sample on a piece of chromatography paper, and you just dip the tip into the solvent and let it hang in it, and then the solvent will slowly get absorbed up into that chromatography paper. As it passes by the solvent, or excuse me, the sample, then certain pigments or materials are going to dissolve easier. And as the solvent line moves up the chromatography paper, certain materials are going to be carried faster or easier by the solvent, and those things that don't get carried easily lag behind. So they get separated out by their solubility. Now, there are a couple videos available in the in the file version of this, if you go onto your Canvas page, in the module, you can click on the notes and you can link to these videos, which we highly encourage you to view. All right, that brings me to photosynthesis, and this is the complex part of what we need to talk about in this video. Photosynthesis is a chemical process of combining carbon dioxide and water in the chloroplast of a plant with the application of energy from the sun. And okay, sorry, I just wanted to make sure that I corrected that. That 12 should be subscript in sugar. So this is a formula for glucose, and one of the waste products is going to be oxygen. The coefficients, the sixes, are relevant, and you should know them. There's a video here that links to a crash course on photosynthesis. Highly recommend that you watch it, but make sure that you've taken the time to read through your notes, because he does go into a little more detail than we need. All right, so the photosynthetic reactions to make this chemical reaction occur happen in two main ways. There's a light reaction, which is dependent on the energy from sunlight, and we call that photosystem 2. And then there's a dark reaction, which is not really in the dark at all, actually. It's the light independent reaction. You're probably wondering what all these names are. They're literally all describing the same thing. So the dark reaction is where carbon fixation or the carbon combinations occur. It's known as the Calvin cycle or photosystem 1, and it is light independent. So it does not require light, but it happens all day, right? It is kind of ironic or counterintuitive that we would have photosystem 2 occur before photosystem 1, but it is the way it is. I don't claim to know why they do that. But photosystem 2 occurs in the grana of a chloroplast. So chloroplasts have stacks of green discs called grana, and they're just membrane bound. In order to use those membranes to create ion gradients, charged particle gradients. So photosystem 2 and photosystem 1 both produce ATP and NADPH, right? And those are energy carrying molecules. During photosystem 2, or the light reaction, this is primarily identified as the phase where photolysis occurs. Photolysis is the breakdown of water. It's splitting water into hydrogen and oxygen. All of the oxygen is released from photosynthesis, is from the water that you split. Right? The plant splits so much water that the oxygen that's left over is used for the mitochondria, and there's excess. Remember that plants also require mitochondria to convert sugars into ATP. So let's talk about the dark reaction then. This occurs in the stroma. Now, this is outside of the stacks of green membranes that are found in the chloroplasts, but it's still inside of the chloroplast. I'll take a moment and I'll go back to this first page just to show you more clearly that relationship. So here's the inside of the chloroplast, and a leaf cell or a plant cell is going to have oodles and oodles of chloroplasts in it. And all of those chloroplasts will have these stacks of grana. and they're made up of thylakoid membranes. These membranes have the pigments, the green pigments inside of them. The stroma is the liquid or fluid that surrounds these. All right, so photosystem 2 happens in the green stacks of the grana, but photosystem 1 occurs in the solution that surrounds those grana. No light required, and hydrogen atoms from light reaction and carbon dioxide molecules are used to produce a 3-carbon PGAL. Now, you're also going to see this referred to as G3P. It's the same material. It's just different research has abbreviated this in different ways. So PGAL is the same thing as G3P, but having that 3 in there helps us identify a little bit more that it's a 3-carbon compound. They use these 3-carbon compounds to combine in order to generate sugars. You might be thinking right now that, oh yeah, I can see that carbon. If there are 3 carbons in G3P and there are 6 carbons in a sugar, there must be a need for 2 G3Ps in order to make 1 sugar. And you'd be sort of right, but you're not. Actually, it takes multiples of this, and the plant cell has enzymes that will combine the G3Ps into multiples, larger carbon chains, and it will slowly cleave off or chop off segments. All right. So it's not really just a combine 2 and you're all done. It's more complicated than that. And the video that we directed you to does actually do a nice job of showing that, but he talks real fast. I linked another one on here. This is the Kelvin cycle, which is the photosystem 1 description. And this is a little more straightforward, and it's got a little Seuss kind of feel to it. During photosynthesis, light energy is changed to glucose, which is chemical energy. Then those plant cells have to do cellular respiration just like we do. This requires mitochondria. So even though we don't have chloroplasts, plants have mitochondria like we do, and you learned that mitochondria require oxygen. It just so happens that plants have spare oxygen laying around. So here's the light reaction in general. This occurs in the grana, which are those stacks of membranes, and this is the light-dependent reaction. We call this photosystem, this is photosystem 2. All right. So the sunlight hits the water. There's an enzyme. There's an enzyme that allows for the wavelengths of energy to split water. The oxygen is released, and it's going to be eliminated by the plant. But the hydrogens are utilized in a series of reactions that will fix those carbons together. Sorry about that. It'll combine them together using those 3-carbon PGALs or G3P, as we mentioned earlier, to combine them to make glucose. So there's a series of 2 continuously cycling reactions that occur over and over again. And it's worth mentioning, actually, that the cycling is one of the most important parts because the building blocks are reused. And that's mentioned even in greater detail in the videos. Let's talk about the structure of a leaf. All right, there is a vascular plants crash course that we linked here. I like how they cover everything pretty quick, so I recommend you watch them. Most photosynthesis occurs in leaves, but there are other plants that utilize different structures, different types of photosynthetic organisms also that do this. Most of the photosynthesis occurs in the leaf blade, but some does occur in the stem. It's just limited. The leaf is divided up into layers, and you need to be familiar with what's going on in each one of these layers. The epidermis is the upper and lower outer layer of the leaf, and it's typically covered in a cuticle. So the outer layer is the epidermis, just like on our skin, the epidermis, or your skin is the epidermis. Plants have an epidermis as well. But sandwiched in between this layer of epidermal cells are there are guard cells. Well, okay, so this kind of jumps a little bit. I want to talk about the palisade layer first because I want to go from top to bottom. All right, so the palisade layer is, if you think of like a palace, it's going to have big, tall towers. Well, the palisade mesophyll is tall plant cells that are all stacked one next to another right underneath the epidermis, and this is loaded with chloroplast because this is where the majority of photosynthesis occurs. Now I'm going to go down a little bit farther and point out spongy mesophyll. Spongy mesophyll is going to have fewer chloroplasts, but it's going to have lots of space available. The space allows for gas exchange. And that's where on the lower epidermis, there are little holes. Those holes, as I scroll up a little bit more, called stoma, are openings that allow for the exchange of oxygen, carbon dioxide, and for excess water to escape. Guard cells are the guards of the stoma. They are going to be able to regulate opening and closing those stoma based on how much water is available to the plant. As the guard cells become saturated with water, they fill up and they bow outward. And when that guard cell is filled with water, the stomate opens up. But as a plant starts to dry out, if there's less water available, those guard cells get a little floppy and softer and they close. And so that will have the ability to shrink the size of the stoma and reduce the amount of gas exchange, which is going to slow down photosynthesis. So guard cells have a way or have the ability to decrease the amount of photosynthesis that a plant is actually doing. Another very, very important tissue that's found here is the circulatory system of the plants, and that's going to include xylem and phloem. The veins, I'm sorry that it keeps jumping. I'm not sure why it does it. All right, so the veins or vascular tissue of a plant are called xylem and phloem. They have two specific jobs. Food flows in the phloem. Right? This is going to carry sugars. And xylem is responsible for carrying specifically water up to the roots, the leaves, and the stems. Right? So phloem carries sugars, and xylem carries water and minerals. There is a slight difference between the two types of tubules. The xylem, which carries the water and minerals, those tubes are actually larger than the phloem. The phloem are really fine tubes, and the xylem are a little bit larger to carry a greater volume of material. Okay, let's talk about roots, which are another specialized type of tissue. So we had the specialized cells of the leaves. Now we have the specialized cells of the roots. These are designed for anchoring the plant. They're designed for nutrient storage. If you're a carrot, well, you're not a carrot. If the plant is a carrot, for that matter, right? These are storage structures where the plant will pack these filled with carbohydrates. Potatoes are examples of these. Parsnips. These are rutabaga, turnips, radishes. They're all specialized roots that have been designed to store nutrients. Roots also are designed for absorption of water and minerals. This happens by diffusion and active transport. And there are two main styles that a root will take. You'll have tap roots and you'll have fibrous roots. Both are shown here. A tap root is primarily one solid large root, and carrots, dandelions, beets, and radishes all have tap roots. And then you have fibrous roots, and fibrous roots include things like onions have fibrous root system. Garlic does. So do scallions, and grass does too. So when you pull up a clump of grass and it's got all those roots, that's a fibrous root system. There are parts to the root also, though. The root has an epidermis, which is on the outside, and that epidermis will have root hairs. That's going to increase the surface area for absorption of water. So that's going to be very helpful to maintain as much moisture inside of the plant as possible. There's going to be a root cap, which is going to be right over the top of what's known as the apical meristem. Apical means apex, meaning the point of something. So the apex is the point. Apical meristem is the point of the plant tissue where it's growing most rapidly. This is new growth, and this is going to allow the root to grow and push down through the soil. There is ground tissue and cortical tissue, or cortex. This is responsible for transporting water and storing starches. And there's also endodermis, which is inside. You'll see there's a layer of this wrapped around the inside. It's a cylinder that encloses all the vascular tissue, which is the xylem and phloem. So you've got the root hairs and the epidermis. There's all that absorption of water into and through the apical meristem. It's going to go right through the endodermis and into the xylem and phloem. That brings me to stems, which are a third type of specialized tissue. All right, now stems are responsible for lifting or displaying leaves to get as much sunlight as possible. All right, they can be adapted for different types of environments. The spines on a cactus are actually reduced sized leaves. And the reason why they're so reduced in size is because if the cactus had broad leaves, it would dry out incredibly fast. So it's an environmental adaptation. The plant has adapted to living in a dry, hot climate where it has reduced leaf size, and it also will have a really thick, waxy coating or cuticle to prevent water loss, which is why cactuses and other succulents like aloe or kalanchoe, these are plants that have thick, waxy membranes to reduce water loss. But I would mention even evergreen trees like Christmas trees, they have reduced leaf sizes too, and they have thick, waxy coatings on the leaves of the tree. And that's to enable the plant to avoid drying out in a cold, dry environment. When it's very, very cold, I think we all know in the winter, your skin can dry out pretty easily. Now, a stem can develop nodes, buds, and lenticels. These are all important structures on the sides of the plant or the stem. The nodes are where leaves attach. Buds are where undeveloped tissues that are going to produce new stems and leaves. So we know what I think you know that there are terminal buds at the ends of little branches, and we can identify those in the spring. They're going to be coming out soon. Lenticels are a different structure that's easy to overlook. Lenticels are tiny little dots or gas openings to allow for gas exchange in the stem itself. So the lenticels are these tiny little holes that are found around the stem, and then this little chunk that's out of the side would be a node. So the two main types are monocots and dicots. Mono meaning one, right? Monocot stems have randomly scattered vascular tissue around the stem. The vascular tissue, remember, is the vascular bundles are xylem and phloem. So this is a more primitive type of plant development, and this is going to include corn, grasses, non-woody plants. For instance, dicots are a higher, more developed evolutionary development of plants. They have vascular bundles that are clearly divided into an outside and an inside. There's xylem and phloem clearly separated from an interior pith or cortex. And there's just a single ring around the outside of all this vascular tissue. So you have the outside, and then you have the inside, which is just cortex or pith. The vascular bundles in dicots are arranged around the edge. It has primary growth, which occurs at the apical meristem, called the vascular cambium and the cork cambium. These are found around the outside, okay? So just under the bark of a typical tree will be the cambium. And that's where all the primary growth occurs. The growth doesn't occur primarily in the pith. It's going to be on the outside edges. That's going to be different from how monocots behave and grow. All right. So usually this is thick, tough, woody tissue, and it lives more than 2 years. A lot of the monocots are annuals or perennials. Xylem accumulates as annual growth rings, so you can measure the growth of a dicot by counting the rings that develop or accumulate in that plant. And then xylem and cork phloem and cork continually will peel off as it grows. All right, let's talk about water transport. Active transport and root pressure can cause water to move from the soil into the roots. Active transport requires ATP, so it's going to be adding energy. All right, active transport requires ATP to pump it in. Root pressure, however, is also important, and root pressure has to do with, it's almost like hydraulic pressure. And we're going to talk about how that water will get pulled right up those vascular tubes, the xylem, and the tendency is to do that as water evaporates. And number 2 and number 3 are going to tie right together. See, we learned earlier in the year that water is a polar molecule. It has it has a positive side and a negative side. And so they want to stick together. The positives are attracted to the negatives. Well, if some of that water is evaporating off of the plant, which is called transpiration, as it evaporates, it's going to be pulling more water in because something's got to fill the space. Because of that attraction between the water molecules and between the water molecules and the plant itself, right? Those tiny little tubes are able to, the water is able to stick to the inside of those tubes. That's capillary action. So both number 2 and number 3, capillary action and transpiration, happen as a result of water being attracted to other parts. Plant excretion. Plants will recycle gases that they create. So the oxygen that is generated as a waste product from photosynthesis is used for respiration. And the waste products of respiration, which is carbon dioxide, can be used in photosynthesis. Plants are great recyclers. The toxic waste that plants produce, the waste materials, are stored in vacuoles, so they're able to prevent injury to the plant. There are some specialized types of plants that are interesting to think about. I'm sure you were imagining it earlier. There are carnivorous plants that have specialized features to obtain nutrients. This includes the Venus flytrap and the pitcher plant. These two species or groups of plant species evolved in environments with very poor soil. There's not a lot of nitrogen in the soil that these live in. And nitrogen is important for making proteins. So the plants evolved a mechanism to get protein. And they started producing enzymes that could break down proteins. All they needed to do was catch something. Well, pitcher plants have a designed internal structure that make it really hard for for insects to climb out. There's a little pool of digestive enzymes at the bottom. The insect flies in because it smells good. There's an attractant in there. It falls in. It tries to climb out. It can't. It's a terrible thing. Oh, the humanity, the poor fly dies at the bottom. Same thing with the Venus flytrap, except Venus flytraps are much smaller than a lot of people think. They're teeny tiny plants. They only catch teeny tiny insects or little tiny animals like this little frog. This poor guy, maybe he'll get away, maybe he won't. I'm not sure. Which brings me to our last slide, which is plant hormones. And this allows for plants to grow in a directed manner. So tropisms are growth in a specific way. Gibberellins and auxins allow this to happen. They're both examples of types of hormones. Gibberellins cause the development of fruit and seeds. And that's why if you keep certain fruits together on your counter or in a bag, they can stimulate each other's ripening. This has to do with hormone production. Also, auxins are a hormone that's produced in the apical meristem. We mentioned that at the tips of roots and the tips of the growth areas on the stem. This is where the most growth occurs. This also allows plants to grow in a specific direction, which is what tropisms are. There are a couple different varieties. There's phototropism, which is how plants grow towards sunlight. And there's a great image of how this happens in this diagram here. The shaded area gets larger, right? The auxins are produced here, causing those cells to grow. And they're not produced on the sunny side So they're smaller, and the extension and growth of these cells that are in the shade will force the plant to start to curve towards the light. And that's how a plant grows towards the light. There are also gravitationally sensitive structures in the roots. And I can describe that as a stem, or excuse me, as a seed grows, the first growths off of the out of the seed are going to be for a pair of leaves. Those are going to grow up because of phototropism, but there's also going to be a root that appears out of the stem, or out of the seed, excuse me. And that's going to grow downward because of gravitropism. It's attracted to the gravitational pull of the earth. All right, so there was a lot in that, and I know I covered it really quickly, but as always, if you have any questions, ask your teacher, and feel free to come see us on Wednesday Extra Help. Have a great day.